Let's now wrap up the topic of ritual in politics. I want to first review some of the arguments in David Kurtzer's book. Later, I will revisit our discussion question in light of our course materials about Catalonia's human towers and the gathering at Susan B. Anthony's grave on Election Day 2016. In the excerpts that we read from David Kurtzer's book, Ritual, Politics, and Power, he examines how ubiquitous ritual is in the political world, and he explores various mechanisms by which ritual action can influence political action. First, he notes that the excitement of participating in a collective ritual is itself compelling. We may be drawn into participation through that excitement and then become exposed to new or reworked political ideas and arguments. Ritual also often involves what he calls on page 100 the, quote, contagiousness of emotion, so that one gets swept away by the emotional states of others in a crowd. Another reason we are often drawn into and are persuaded by rituals is that, since rituals rely upon symbols and myths that are familiar to us, they help establish a sense of continuity in our lives. That, in his words on page 10, quote, I am the same person today as I was 20 years ago and as I will be 10 years from now, end quote. As we move forward in life and experience so many changes, activities that help us find continuity in our lives, that anchor our sense of self, are enormously magnetic. In this course, we have already talked about the fact that ritual is powerful in part because so many of its messages are communicated without words, but instead through symbolic action and embodiment. Kurtzer notes that because the meanings of symbols are often multiple and ambiguous, they cannot be argued against. On page 13, he quotes the Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi, who said that, quote, since rituals are nonverbal, they have no contraries, end quote. How does one use words to argue against a nonverbal message? Kurtzer also adds that beliefs can be shaped through ritual through the process of resolving what is called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is an uncomfortable psychological state in which one recognizes that some of one's beliefs may be contradictory or that one's actions are at odds with one's beliefs. Psychologists have noted that people typically seek to resolve this uncomfortable cognitive dissonance by altering their beliefs. Kurtzer gives the example of the Nazi salute. Even if one at first resists giving the salute, one may be afraid not to do so because of the consequences, but then, after continuing to give the salute so many times, one may alter how one feels about the salute and the Nazi regime because the state of having one's actions and beliefs at odds creates too much psychic discomfort. Finally, Kurtzer adds on page 101 that ritual, quote, presents a picture of the world that is so emotionally compelling that it is beyond debate, end quote. To expand on this, I would say that rituals are moments of collective representation of the world and our place in it. Through wielding symbols, moving our bodies and objects in actions that are dripping with symbolic meaning, through making meaningful gestures in relationship to others, we co-create a world, often one that is emotionally uplifting. For a time, this ritual world is our world. It is a happy place where we feel comfortable, relieved, forgiven, or optimistic. We want those feelings to continue, so we go forward into the non-ritual world, intent upon recreating those relationships and moments. If we can think back to Driver's chapter on transformation, recall how he said in Ritual that we, quote, rehearse our future. Ritual action is so pervasive in our lives, and we continually create new ritual experiences because they are a way for us as groups of participants to envision new worlds, rehearse them, and co-create them. Now I want to address the dichotomy of conservatism and creativity that is the organizing framework of the discussion question for this topic. On page 12, Kurtzer indicates that, quote, ritual does have this creative potential, it also has a conservative bias, end quote. He's referring to the fact that rituals change slowly. And yet, he adds, quote, paradoxically, it is the very conservatism of ritual forms that can make ritual a potent force in political change, end quote. Let's unpack what he means by that. He notes that rituals have to rely on symbols and symbolic actions that we inherit from the past. The only way that symbols and rituals can have pervasive emotional force is if they seem familiar and resonant. Any leaders seeking to use ritual performances to ignite political action will need to go to the well to draw upon symbols, myths, and ritual actions inherited from the past. Leaders can alter them to repurpose them for a new political agenda, but I would add that changes must be made carefully so that the leader does not seem too radical, cynical, or self-serving. In sum, Kurtzer indicates that ritual is the best tool for political persuasion because of the way that it involves cognition, emotion, and embodiment, and obliges participants to move in ways that signal to other people their political commitments. I would add that a skillful leader must be an imaginative master of ritual, drama, and spectacle, calling symbols, myths, and ritual actions from the past and fashioning them into a new ritual performance that sways its participants, gaining their consent and commitment. In other words, rituals have innovative political potential, but only if they deploy symbols and symbolic actions from out of the past, ultimately making it seem as if the past, present, and imagined future are all part of the same trajectory, and that the imagined future is the logical outgrowth of the mythic past, a destiny that was prophesized. The two ethnographic cases that we considered in this unit demonstrate the creative tension between conservatism and innovation that Kurtzer touched on. You read Marianne Vachi's Catalonia's Human Towers, Nationalism, Associational Culture, and the Politics of Performance. Castell is the word for castle in the Catalan language, which originates in Catalonia, an administrative region in northern Spain. A movement for independence from Spain has been growing in the region, and in October 2015, a motion to secede was only very narrowly defeated. As a spirit for independence has been growing in Catalonia, building castells, these human towers, has emerged as an iconic performance of building a nation. An icon is a type of sign that has what is called a formal relationship to the thing that it represents. In other words, it looks like the thing that it represents. Catalonians often remark that, quote, building a nation is like building castells. The castell is seen as the perfect icon of the nation because of the way that it depends upon large numbers of people working together, supporting one another, adjusting to one another, men, women, and children, regardless of ethnic origin, language, social class, or political party. It is also seen as uniquely suited to nation building because it requires two things that Catalonians consider culturally theirs: both steady nerves, seni, and a touch of madness or daring, Rauscha. To tie this into Kurtzer's question about conservatism and innovation, we learn that building castells is a cultural performance that dates back 200 years in southern Catalonia, and so it has antiquity and therefore effective power or emotional force as a symbol of Catalonia. Vachi notes, though, that it has not always been the symbol of Catalonia employed by independence activists. In past decades, soccer, the Sardana dance, and fire festivals have all been employed. They have all been discarded, however, and castell building has become a prominent activity associated with the independence movement because of how building castells entails the political work that nation building requires, building a community out of, quote, diversity, solidarity, and communal effort, end quote, using the, quote, values of strength, balance, courage, and common sense, end quote. Consequently, while the castell is deeply rooted in Catalonian history, castell building was dusted off, re-energized, and leveraged to undertake the risky and uncertain innovative work of secession. Finally, we can consider the gathering of voters at Susan B. Anthony's grave in Rochester, New York on Election Day 2016. In my book chapter, I also considered the question of the conservatism of ritual and political change. I concluded that the voters gathered there were hoping for political change, specifically for civil rights and respect for groups of people they believed to be under threat: women, racial, ethnic, religious, and sexual minorities, and people with disabilities. They were seeking change, but they did so, interestingly, through embracing symbols of time depth: a long-deceased suffragist hero, a weather-worn gravestone, the long-standing tradition of placing gifts at graves, and the Declaration of Sentiments first penned in 1848. These elements, rooted in the past, lent an aura of authenticity and sacredness to the gathering that sought to take the long-standing promise of equality and actualize it in the future, to bring it into being. Reflecting on these two examples, I would conclude that, curiously, the conservatism of ritual is exactly where its innovatory potential comes from. Those who wish to stimulate political thought and action can harness and utilize the emotional force embedded in symbols, myths, and rituals rooted in long-standing traditions. Doing so effectively requires giving due reverence to the past while painting the future as the natural culmination of the actions of the ancestors, a specific destiny realized and fulfilled.